Something strange happens inside the justice system. Two people can commit nearly the same act, yet walk away with completely different fates. One gets locked away for life, another is out in a few decades, and a third is sent down a path no one expected. And the reasons behind those decisions aren't always as simple as what they did. Today, we're breaking down some of the most unsettling cases where the punishment shocked the public, confused legal experts, and exposed how unpredictable the system can be. Because once you see how these sentences were decided, you'll realize the story is far more twisted than people think. The story begins with a quiet high school senior who kept almost everything to himself, except the disturbing notes teachers later admitted they'd noticed but never fully understood. For months, he drifted through the halls with this eerie calm, barely speaking, barely reacting, but always watching. And when he finally snapped, the entire community was left staring at a crime so calculated it looked like he'd planned every step long before anyone realized something was wrong. What shocked people wasn't just the act itself, it was what happened next. Prosecutors pushed for the harshest punishment possible, convinced he'd been preparing for this moment for years. But the defense argued he was spiraling, mentally unstable, and too young to grasp what he was doing. The trial dragged on for months, filled with arguments about motive, mindset, and whether someone his age could truly understand the damage he'd caused. And then came the twist. Instead of the penalty many expected, the judge delivered a sentence that split the entire state in half, some calling it a disaster, others calling it mercy. But this wasn't the only case that left the public stunned, and the next one shows just how unpredictable these outcomes can be. Only a year earlier, another case hit the headlines, one that still confuses people when they look at the sentencing. This time, the defendant was a 28-year-old warehouse worker from a nearby city, someone who'd spent months arguing with coworkers, posting angry late-night rants, and getting into confrontations that should have set off alarms. His outburst happened suddenly, during a shift change, and even though the damage he caused was serious, it wasn't nearly on the scale of what the high school senior had done. No detailed planning, no long-term build-up, no journal filled with dark hints. Just a chaotic snap in the middle of a heated argument. Yet the courtroom treated him entirely differently. Prosecutors didn't hold back for a second. They painted him as unpredictable, dangerous, a walking time bomb, who could never be trusted again. The jury barely needed a day to agree. And when sentencing arrived, he received a punishment far heavier than anyone expected, years beyond what similar cases usually brought, with no chance for early release. People questioned how someone who acted impulsively could end up with a harsher fate than someone who planned everything in advance. But the next case shows how a defendant's behavior can shift everything in ways no one sees coming. Then came a case that disturbed people for an entirely different reason. The defendant was a 22-year-old college student whose calm, almost emotionless demeanor became the center of the entire trial. From the moment he was arrested, officers noted how he spoke in short, detached sentences, as if he were recounting someone else's actions, not his own. In court, it only got stranger. While families waited for some sign of remorse, he stared straight ahead, unmoved. When his lawyers mentioned stress, isolation, and a downward spiral his friends later confirmed, he didn't react. And when the prosecution read out messages he'd written weeks before the incident, cold, cryptic lines that hinted at a growing obsession, he sat there as if it meant nothing. The jury wasn't just responding to the crime. They were responding to him. His lack of emotion, the unsettling silence, the way he carried himself, it all fed into the narrative that he'd been aware of what he was doing long before the moment everything fell apart. Because of that, the sentence he received was severe, far harsher than experts predicted. But what happened in the next case pushed the justice system into even darker territory, where fear spread far beyond the courtroom. Another case shook an entire city, not because of what happened in one moment, but because of the panic that followed. This time, the suspect was a 31-year-old delivery driver who'd been acting strangely for months. Neighbors reported late-night arguments with himself, sudden disappearances, and unsettling comments about people watching him. Most brushed it off as paranoia, until the day everything erupted. The incident itself was contained quickly, but the aftermath was unlike anything the community had ever experienced. Schools locked down, businesses closed early, helicopters circled overhead for hours as officers searched block by block, unsure if the suspect had acted alone or if something bigger was unfolding. Social media amplified the fear, spreading rumors faster than authorities could shut them down. By the time he was captured, the entire city was on edge. Parents wouldn't let their kids walk outside. Stores stayed half empty, and residents demanded the harshest sentence possible, not just for the crime, but for the chaos, anxiety, and sleepless nights that followed. In court, prosecutors argued that the damage extended far beyond the immediate victims. They described the community-wide panic, the emergency response, the resources pulled from across the state. The judge agreed, delivering a punishment that reflected the fear he unleashed, not just the act itself. But even this wasn't the most divisive case. The next defendant sparked a national argument that still hasn't settled. The next case ignited a firestorm long before the trial even started. The defendant was a 26-year-old tech support worker whose motives were so confusing that the entire country split into two sides: those demanding the harshest punishment imaginable, and those arguing he was a deeply unstable person who'd slipped through every crack in the system. It began when investigators uncovered weeks of messages he'd sent to friends and strangers online. Scattered, frantic posts where he hinted that he was losing control, mixed with bold statements that prosecutors later claimed showed clear intent. Supporters said the messages were cries for help. Critics said they were warnings nobody took seriously. When the case hit court, both sides fought like it was the trial of the decade. Psychologists testified for hours about his mental state. Prosecutors insisted he knew exactly what he was doing. Defense attorneys countered with medical records, family testimonies, and a story of someone spiraling in ways no one fully understood. Every hearing drew crowds. Protesters filled the sidewalks. News channels ran non-stop debates. And when the judge finally delivered the sentence, a middle ground punishment that neither side felt satisfied with, the entire nation reacted at once. Some said he'd gotten off too lightly. Others said the system had punished someone who needed treatment, not a cage. But even with all the outrage this case created, the next one pushed the debate even further, because the defendant wasn't an adult at all. Then came the case that shocked people for a completely different reason. The defendant was only 15. He looked more like a freshman worried about exams than someone standing trial for a life-changing crime. But investigators quickly uncovered a digital trail that painted a much darker picture. Hidden chat logs, late-night posts, and voice memos he'd recorded to himself revealed a kid who'd been unraveling quietly for months. Teachers later admitted they'd noticed strange behavior, isolating himself, avoiding friends, scribbling cryptic phrases in notebooks, but nothing that screamed danger. His parents, overwhelmed and unsure how to reach him, sought help too late, and by the time the incident happened, authorities said he'd crossed a line he couldn't come back from. In court, everything focused on one question: how do you punish a crime committed by someone barely old enough to drive? Prosecutors argued that his planning and the disturbing digital notes showed intent far beyond his age. The defense countered that his brain was still developing, that he was acting out of confusion and emotional chaos, not true malice. When sentencing day arrived, nobody knew which direction it would go. Some expected the judge to lean toward rehabilitation, others feared the court would make an example out of him. But instead, the judge delivered a ruling that stunned everyone: one of the harshest juvenile sentences the state had ever given. And yet, age wasn't always the deciding factor. In another case, prosecutors faced a battle so complicated that even a guilty verdict didn't guarantee the outcome they wanted. Not every crime committed by a minor ends neatly in court. In some instances, the law struggles to balance accountability with the reality of youth. One case involved a 16-year-old who had orchestrated a violent attack at a local gathering, leaving several injured. Witnesses described a calm, methodical execution, chilling in contrast to the suspect's teenage appearance. The prosecution pushed for adult charges, arguing that the planning, execution, and callous disregard for human life mirrored adult criminal behavior. Defense attorneys, however, painted a picture of a child manipulated by circumstances, bullying, unstable home life, and exposure to violent media. Psychiatric evaluations revealed severe emotional and developmental issues, further complicating the case. Public opinion was divided. Some demanded maximum punishment, emphasizing the victim's trauma and the danger posed by letting the minor return to society too soon. Others argued for rehabilitation, citing research showing that adolescent brains are still malleable and capable of change. Ultimately, the court imposed a hybrid sentence, a combination of life with eligibility for parole in adulthood, paired with intensive psychiatric care. The decision sparked debate about whether the justice system should prioritize retribution, protection of society, or the potential for reform when dealing with young offenders.